Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Roggio, Senior Fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. And this is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers all things jihadist activity and what used to be known as the Global War on Terror, what we call the Long War. Today, I am pleased to be rejoined by my colleague and friend, Caleb Weiss. Caleb is a research fellow at the Bridgeway Foundation, and he also contributes to FDD's Long War Journal. Caleb is just a remarkable sponge on all issues jihad. And when I want to know what's going on, particularly in Africa, I go to Caleb, but Caleb also knows Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, and he tracks it in Central Asia and South Asia. He knows what's going on in Iraq and in Syria and elsewhere. So, welcome, Caleb. Thanks for joining us. And, again, thanks as always for your hard work.
Thank you for having me again. Always glad to be here. I definitely need new hobbies because, the definition or the outline you just gave me of that was a real eye opener.
Yeah. Well, we all need new hobbies that often to get away from the jihad. It helps cleanse the mind. This is such a depressing and grinding topic. I've been doing this professionally since 2005, 6. It really is a long war. When I decided to name the website the Long War Journal in 2007 and launched it, I think even I may have underestimated just how long this war would be. And, I think we struck gold and we got lucky on that one.
Oh yeah. Unfortunately.
Yeah. No one more than me would love this to end and me go to look for another job. It's a real grind. And unfortunately the grind means that we're not winning because we have not defeated our enemies. These groups exist, persist, and some are still achieving success. But today, Caleb and I are going to discuss Ayman al Zawahiri. Yep, he's still alive. He's not dead like some people have, some in our profession have claimed. I think it was, what was it, late 2020 or 2021?
Yeah, this was late 2020.
2020, where you had some analysts out there saying, based on their sources, authoritatively insisting that he was dead. And it was picked up in the counterterrorism community, even though we saw no evidence of this. He's since released a couple of videos and audios, and we're going to discuss two of those. And in one of them, in a speech commemorating Osama bin Laden, Zawahiri explicitly mentions the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I'll quote from his speech. We're going to get into more of what he says here, but the first point I want to make is that he's still alive, at least as of February 24th, when Russia launched the invasion of Ukraine. And here's what he said, quote, "America is weak in front of our Muslim Ummah if it unites," it being the Ummah and it unites. "America is in a state of weakness and decline by the grace of Allah. Here it is after its defeat in Iraq and Afghanistan, after the economic disasters caused by the 9/11 invasions, that would be Al-Qaeda's attacks on the U.S., after the corona pandemic, and after it left its ally Ukraine as prey for the Russians," end quote. So, look, since he's reemerged and those who claimed that Zawahiri was dead now had to backtrack, what the common narrative is, okay, well, maybe he's alive, but he's a nobody. He's not an influential figure in the jihad or even within Al-Qaeda. He's, just as they tried to brand Osama bin Laden as a lion in winter, holed up in a compound in Pakistan, even though he was directing the global jihad. And
some still are making that argument too.
Yeah, right. They're still making these arguments. We see something different. We see Al-Qaeda's branches, some having great success. Al-Qaeda's central leadership, it's still organized. It still, pledges fealty to Zawahiri. And they're following Zawahiri's guidance and orders that come down from top and bottom. We see evidence over time. Caleb, what's your take on this? why is Zawahiri still an important figure in jihad? And we'll get into a little bit of what is the state of Al-Qaeda under Zawahiri's leadership.
I mean, I think what you said was pretty accurate. I mean, there's still evidence of branches around the world still following, his orders or guidelines or commands or, other things like that. I think the most striking example of that is the Al-Quds being Jerusalem will never be Judaized campaign. I think this was in 2020, maybe early 2021, but a couple of years ago, regardless, it was this, whole media series around AQ that Jerusalem will never be Judaized. This was around when the U.S. Embassy was being moved to Jerusalem. And you saw two AQ branches in Africa, that being Al-Shabaab in Somalia and JNIM, or the Group for Support of Islam and Muslims in the Sahel, both doing suicide attacks in the name of that campaign, showing broader coordination, broader, operational coordination, broader media coordination with Al-Qaeda's central leadership. That doesn't just happen if there isn't some sort of guidelines coming from the top. There's going to be some sort of media, at least media cooperation or coordination on that. But we know that there's probably more than that. But you also see groups still remaining in the AQ fold. If Zawahiri was really that irrelevant, why would a group like Ansaru was this group in northwest Nigeria, that was, it existed, 2012 to around 2015. And then there was this period of dormancy. And then it reemerged in the late 2019 and has since been super active in northwest Nigeria, but is openly, loyal to Zawahiri. It's openly loyal to AQIM. If Zawahiri was still, this irrelevant old man, and the AQ is this dying brand, why would this group still want to be a part of it? And you see this not only in Africa, but you see this, around the world. You still have groups all over the world that still proclaim their allegiance to AQ. And we'll get into some of these as we talk about some of these videos from Zawahiri. But, it's global. Like, people still want to follow him. And to me, that's not really something indicative of, an old or relevant man, as some people like to say he is, which he is old. I'll give them that argument. But, some of the arguments that we see against AQ, I like to call the AQ minimalists, is that, these global branches are concerned about the local. But I think that's more of a false dichotomy that we as analysts make. And I've said this on the show before, of like, the jihadists themselves don't make that distinction. Like, the local and the global are one and the same. What happens to a Muslim in Morocco is going to be a crime against Muslims anywhere around the world. Abdullah Azzam said that, Zawahiri says that, but Bin Laden said that. The crimes against Muslims anywhere is a crime against Muslims everywhere. And that's how they see it. That's how jihadists see themselves as part of this global fight, even though they may be fighting, the Somali army in southern Somalia. They still see that as a fight of like the same thing that JNIM is doing in Mali, the same thing that, AQIS is doing in Afghanistan or Pakistan. Same thing that, a group in Syria is doing. It's all one and the same. And to be clear, like, AQ, well, yes, they've done major attacks in the West. That's not always been like their main focus. They've always had this idea of being the vanguard force for local Muslim insurgencies. You saw that in the early 90s. You saw that in the mid 90s in Afghanistan, even in Africa. I'm focusing on Africa because that's, obviously my main focus. But even in the early 90s, Bin Laden was sending people to East Africa, to Sudan, to Somalia, elsewhere to help train local insurgencies in that region or elsewhere. The GIA helped them, helped the, Eritrean Islamic Jihad, helped, Al-Ittihad in Somalia. You had all of these groups that even in the early 90s were being helped by Al-Qaeda. If they were purely just, focused on attacks in the West, why would they do that? Why would they still want to help these local groups? It's part of one and the same, and I think that's a point that people like to look over. And another thing, I'm going on a rant, I'm sorry.
No,
I'm going on a huge rant here, but another thing I see all the time is that, the AQ central leadership, because you mentioned that they are still organized. A lot of people like to say they're disorganized, or like, there's no cohesive structure, or they're dispersed, or, there's no quote unquote safe haven. But a few things about that of like, have they been centralized? Like, yeah, you had like an organized group, an AFPAC, but you also had senior leaders around the world from its inception. I just released, a huge paper on AQIM and JNIM and how it's, historically spread across, northwestern Africa. In the early 2000s, AQ senior leadership sent a guy named Abu Muhammad al-Yemeni. He was a AQ Central, leader by all means. He was sent to Algeria and he perused, what was then called the Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat, the GSPC, which became AQIM. But he visited their training camps in Algeria and Mali and elsewhere, in the early 2000s, 2002, maybe even a little earlier. Abu Muhammad al-Yemeni was reporting to another senior Al-Qaeda leader in Yemen. Even by that time, the AQ central leadership was globally dispersed. It wasn't just all in AFPAC. There were obviously central leaders in Yemen. And, you saw that set up throughout the years. Nasser al-Waheishi becoming, the general manager who was, ACAP's, emir for a while.
Caleb, if I can interrupt you here for a second. This was done as not just because Al-Qaeda was decentralizing its leadership, but as a redundancy because of the drone campaign where Al-Qaeda had its leadership concentrated in Pakistan's tribal areas and some areas in Afghanistan. So having the head of AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Waheishi is the best example of this. But I'm drawing a blank on the last AQIM leader. But he was also by the French said to be Al-Qaeda's third in command. Waheishi was the AQAP leader, was the Al-Qaeda's general manager, which is considered to be a number 3 position as well. So this is part of its efforts to keep its leadership in other theaters. It's a protection, or it's operational security for it.
Right. And there's evidence of this going back at least 20 years.
Absolutely is.
So it's historically a precedent, but yet we're going to say that, it's relatively new and that's what causes AQ to be weak now. But that's not the case, obviously. And this argument of safe haven, or like, AQ doesn't have, the safe haven like it did in, pre 9/11 Afghanistan. But what does safe haven even mean? I mean, you could find evidence of that in Africa, for instance, like by anyone's definition of a safe haven of where, terrorist leaders can safely congregate. There would be places of the Sahel that would be like that. There's places in Somalia that would be like that. There's still places in AFPAC that would be like that.
Yeah, Afghanistan. So
what does that even mean?
Al-Qaeda, without a doubt. Yeah. I mean, we know Al-Qaeda leadership has migrated back to Afghanistan, and U.S. intelligence people that I speak to believe that Zawahiri is there.
Right. I mean, what does that even mean? And, you have safe havens around the world with a decentralized command structure. Yeah. But I don't see that as a weakness of AQ. I see that as a organizational strength. That's an organization built for resilience. That's exactly what that is. Yeah, I just think it's kind of the arguments, or the argument that the minimalists are making is essentially one of you're willingly reducing the threat in order to A, move on to a different threat, or B, to have some sort of sense of mission accomplishment, right? That's the way I see it. I mean, I could be wrong, and I'm happy to be wrong on that. But that's, to me, of what I see happening with these broader arguments.
The people that generally make that argument, and from what they're the ones who advocate for disengaging in the fight against the jihadists. They've used the Al-Qaeda, the localization, as you had noted, as evidence. See, Al-Qaeda just cares about the local. But remember, they made the same arguments against the Islamic State, and that didn't go very well. And it's the same goes for Al-Qaeda, as you said. I mean, Al-Qaeda's goal is to establish a global caliphate. That's its goal, or reestablish the
right. Its but caliphate. How are you going to do that? You're going to work through local means, right?
Exactly. You're going to build it emirate by emirate. Look, I realize there's more to it, the difference between the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. But fundamentally, the big difference is Al-Qaeda says, be patient and don't declare the caliphate until you can defend it. And the Islamic State's version is a caliphate now, with an exclamation point.
AQs is all about the public support, which is why they go to these great lengths to work within the local. That's an operational model. That's not something that, that's happening and weakening the central structure. That's a direct, MO of AQ.
And there's another, a real analytical problem here. The idea that these branches are independent or affiliates, as they're called, Al-Qaeda doesn't refer them to them as their affiliates or branches. I was searching.
They do say branches, farah, which is in Arabic does mean branch. So they do call them branches, which the argument that like Long War Journal has historically made is that using the term affiliates draws some sort of unnecessary distance between the groups when the AQ central leadership itself sees them as just an extension of themselves.
Yeah. They used to refer to this as their theaters. I was digging, and I know I remember writing this up probably 14 years ago, but that's how Al-Qaeda General Command referred to AQAP and AQIM, and they viewed them as their military commands or their leadership commands in the theaters of operation. And I think when you understand it like that, then this idea that there's distance between core, which I hate that term, Al-Qaeda uses general command, and the theaters or branches, then it makes more sense. But unfortunately, people that are arguing for the distance, for the localization, have always been arguing, because you can't disengage with the fight against Al-Qaeda if it has a global, a cohesive global organization that is having success in multiple theaters, and also having problems in multiple theaters as well.
Yeah. I mean, to be clear, just because I'm saying that, these things are operationally good for AQ doesn't mean that they're, far and large successful in all these theaters, because they do face problems. Otherwise the Islamic State would be what it is if they weren't having problems. The Islamic State being literally the outgrowth from AQ because of problems. Yeah.
The Al-Qaeda's biggest problem is, in my opinion, the Islamic State, because it challenges its, you have a division within the Jihad, which is something they've always opposed, right? That's the GIA, all the problems that they had in Algeria. I mean, that was written.
Syria, that was Zawahiri's main messages for years in Syria, is to get all groups together.
Yep. And that to me was, but and again, we can't build a time machine. And but would Osama bin Laden be able to handle that any better than Zawahiri did? We don't know. I suspect there's always tension between the Islam, when previously it was the Islamic State in Iraq, and Al-Qaeda's central leadership. And, we've intercepted messages of, them, the central leadership asking them not to target the Shia. And, Islamic State or Al-Qaeda in Iraq's response was, look, this is a way for us. This is something we need to do. This is driving recruits. So like there was a push and pull, but they weren't ejected from the group until that leadership dispute between Baghdadi and Zawahiri was just irreconcilable. I mean, it would be interesting. Again, we can't build the time machine.
Right. I mean, I can see both sides. I mean, you're going to have people argue that bin Laden was more charismatic, and which that might be true. Doesn't necessarily mean Zawahiri is any worse of a leader. I mean, you still have groups that are still vehemently loyal to Zawahiri, which, again, not indicative of a bad leader.
Yeah, and another thing on his leadership, people say he's boring, he's this and that. Maybe to us as Westerners, but what about to his followers? They have a different vision of what a leader is.
Right. I mean, this is an important point for both of the videos we're discussing later. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about this in the second video we're going to talk about. But I think that's probably the most important part, is that, these videos aren't necessarily made for us.
They're not made for us. That's exactly right, Caleb. You nailed it. This is for their followers, and they resonate. Go for it. Sorry.
No, that's it. Like, I want to save this argument for the next video because I think it has more punch for that one, but that's exactly it. Is like, these videos they're made for people within that mindset. They're made for people who are, might be willing to jump into that mindset. They're not made for us Westerners. They're made exactly for the people who are willing to go down that ideological or, religiously extreme, path. And that's exactly what they are.
Absolutely. Let's move on, and let's remind me to touch back on that point, Caleb, because it's a key one. It's one that really bothers me. I think it's a lot of the analysis of in my estimation in the counterterrorism field it's from our perspective, but I think what you and I and Tom and some select others have done well is looked at it from their perspective. That's how we had success in analyzing these groups. Because you have to understand your enemy. We can't expect them to operate, to act, to speak as we would.
And like the only point I concede on Zawahiri's videos is that, they are boring.
Absolutely.
They're not like the Islamic State flashy videos or, quick speeches from their spokesman or, when their caliphs were releasing statements, audio statements, those. But, they are long, hour-long treatises of, important ideological or religious, frameworks that AQ has to lay down to justify their operations. But, they are boring, and I'll give them that. And for, speaking as a millennial myself, I understand other, probably millennial jihadists or Gen Z jihadists are definitely not attracted to the long treatises as much as, the hyper violence of the Islamic State.
Absolutely. And, it's in this particular video that we're talking about from Zawahiri. Look, I always say he's the Fidel Castro of jihadists. You can wind him up and he'll go all day. But this was actually a pretty short speech by him. I forget how long it was, but reading it, it was like 2 pages. It was pretty, so sometimes he does get his messaging, a little bit more concise, and this actually is an example of that.
I mean, if I were, AQ central leadership, I would probably hire like a Gen Z or millennial, media guy. But that's just me. That's just me.
I mean, look, like Abu Yahi al-Libi. If he was still alive, he would be that guy. He was the up and coming young guy who was in detention at Bagram. And, escaped, and then he became Al-Qaeda's general manager. So that's where the drone campaign was effective in getting rid of some guys like that. Al-Qaeda relied on Abdullah Azzam Amriki, who was just a hot mess because they thought he understood America, but he didn't. But someone like Abu Yahi al-Libi was more of a firebrand, but could, I think he spoke more to a better generation, or a younger generation of potential.
You said it right the first time.
Well, and I don't agree. So I'm going to move on to we'll get into his speech, and I'm not going to requote it, but Zawahiri said America is weak because again we withdrew from Iraq, we withdrew from Afghanistan, and then he mentions the attack on 9/11 and the coronavirus and economic problems and the war in Ukraine. What's your thought about that, Caleb? Is he right? If you're a jihadist, do you look at America as being the strong horse, as Osama bin Laden said, or the weak horse after 21 years of war?
I mean, I'll give you my take in the mindset of a jihadist and then my actual take. So in the mindset of the jihadist, I think he is right. If you're a jihadist, you're going to see the American retreat from Iraq. You're going to see the American retreat from Afghanistan. Troops are going back into Somalia. When Trump was in office, troops were pulled out of Somalia. You saw America in retreat. To me, I think that, if I were a jihadist, I would see that as a great success for our cause. Because, the great Satan is leaving these fields. They're leaving, places where they're killing the Muslims. To me, I think in that respect, he probably is correct. If you were a jihadist, you're definitely going to see these retreats or withdrawals as a success. But speaking as like me, Caleb, as a normal person, I don't know. I think that's hard to say. I think that, in one respect, it is kind of correct of leaving these areas in defeat, which let's be honest, that's what they were. It does leave us in a weaker state. You do see other nation states testing the U.S., Russia and China being the big two, to see what they can do. It's hard to say. I don't want to say that I agree with Zawahiri, but to an extent, I think there is some kernel of truth there, of that we are now in a weaker state.
Yeah, I have to agree with him, not to the extreme, but, like you said, as a jihadist, you look at particularly the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the drawdown in posture. You have Muslim countries in the Middle East starting to question the U.S. commitment. That's something they are certainly monitoring. We know they monitor the media reports. I do think that they may underestimate the West, though. We still have capabilities to hit them and hit them hard.
Yeah, but I don't want to make it seem like I was implying that we didn't. No. I just think in general of our grand posture or stature in the world, you'd definitely be seen as, lacking a little bit of I don't want to say legitimacy, but, at least I can't even think of the word. It's just like we left in such a disgrace in Afghanistan of that we got to be seen as weaker than what we were.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't come to any other conclusion. But I do think they underestimate that the U.S. can hit. Well, actually, I suspect they know it. But at the end of the day, wars are battles of wills. And we've shown to not have the will to see these things through. We see these fights in terms of election cycles, and they see these fights in terms of decades and generations. And when you're committed to a cause like they are, it's, they have an advantage. So, again, I'm not going all in and saying, we are spent, broken, and, easily defeated. But when it comes to engaging in this war, engaging on their ground and on their terms, we've shown a lack of commitment.
I mean, what's the Mullah Omar quote? You have the watches, we have the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and he said in an interview to Voice of America, I want to say it was about 2-3 weeks after 9/11. He said, look, America thinks they'll win, and we believe that, Allah is on our side, and we're going to win, and we're going to find out who's right. We found out. So that goes a long way. The perceptions and the realities of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, to me, allows Zawahiri to say something like this. And I can't easily dismiss it as just jihadist propaganda. It had, sometimes they're right. Again, may not be as right as he thinks it is. We may not be as weak as as he thinks we are, but we do not look like, bin Laden's, strong horse here. All right, next issue. So Zawahiri notes one of Osama bin Laden's he talks about the greatest deeds of bin Laden. And he says, I'll quote from it. He says, one of the greatest deeds of Osama bin Laden revolves around his acting on the magnificent phrase of Sheikh Abdullah Azzam. Jihad has been an individual duty since the fall of Al-Andalus, would be Muslim occupied Spain. Is he correct, Caleb? Is this one of bin Laden's greatest achievements?
I think in terms of actual attacks on the West, yeah. I mean, this is the concept of the individual jihad, the lone jihad, or the quote unquote lone wolf attacks, which are typically anything but that's a separate podcast.
Oh, yeah,
it is. We've seen those, at least since 2009, the underwear bomber, which wasn't necessarily a lone wolf, that was coordinated with ACAP, but still of these individual actors in the West trying to conduct attacks, which some have been successful, some haven't been, some have been thwarted, thankfully thwarted, but some have gotten through. So the Fort Hood shooting, probably the biggest one, the Pensacola attack a couple of years ago. I think this is something, or I guess in Europe, the Charlie Hebdo.
Charlie Hebdo was the one that was coming to my mind. Yeah.
I think that, in that respect, I think that's probably one of the greatest things that AQ has ever done, which has led, to IS, looking at that model and expanding on it to significant success. We saw that again, other French attacks. We saw that, in Brussels, elsewhere. So yeah, I think this is definitely one of bin Laden's great successes. And this is something that AQ, not just Zawahiri, but other AQ branches, celebrate all the time. Shabab just recently celebrated these lone wolf attacks. This was a video which covered it at Long War Journal, but there's a video about Shabab's assassination unit in Mogadishu, but half of the video was dedicated to these lone wolf actors in the West, openly stating, that these are, what Muslims should strive for in the West is these attacks, so, in that degree, which just to go on a brief tangent of what we were discussing earlier, this is also some sign of, at least, to the very least, media coordination between Al-Qaeda branches and the central leadership of, we're going to talk about, attacks in the West. You should probably highlight that as well. Because that's what it seems like, Shabab did. They didn't need to talk about these attacks in the West, but they did. I know that was a weird tangent, but my overall point is yes, like this is something that Al-Qaeda in general, vehemently supports. They celebrate it all the time, and it's still ongoing. Like it's really hard to combat these lone wolf attacks, quote unquote lone wolf attacks, and it's something that we'll probably still face.
Yeah, and I think the point you made about the Islamic State taking that and running with it. Look, from Al-Qaeda's perspective, they may not be happy that it was conducted by its adversary. However, the fact that these attacks are happening, I still think it is a legacy of Osama bin Laden. One of the next deeds, deeds, I'm putting them in quotes. He said, I'll quote from it. It says, this is Zawahiri quote. And among his great deeds was his eagerness to unite the Muslims and resist their division, fragmentation, and separation. I do think Al-Qaeda has, with the expansion of its branches or theaters and, igniting insurgencies and, look, the insurgencies, the jihadist insurgencies that exist today, then you look at pre 9/11. I mean, the jihad, to make a pun, has exploded across Africa and the Middle East and in parts of, South and Central Asia. But, Bin Laden and then Zawahiri weren't able to keep the jihad united, and with the rise of the Islamic State. What's your thoughts on this, Caleb?
No, that's exactly it. Like on one hand, there's been, still group cohesion across much of the world, but this is also the main facet of where AQ has failed. Like, the Islamic State being their greatest failure to keep them in line. So I don't think Zawahiri is right on this one. I think he's conveniently overlooking that little mishap.
Yeah. The split between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State is Al-Qaeda's greatest defeat. The irony in that, right? Of all of the Bin Laden being killed. Hey, look, I'd argue it took him 10 years to get him. And then he was sheltering in our quote unquote ally, the Pakistans, our friends, living outside their basically their, version of West Point, which is what they call a cantonment, which is basically a closed city. Yeah, I mean, all the leaders killed in Afghanistan, the fall of the Taliban in 2001, 2002, the ebb and flows in Yemen and Somalia, where they took territory and then lost it and took it again and lost it. Of all of those, I look at the rise of the Islamic State, the split, in the jihad. To me, that was Al-Qaeda's greatest defeat in all these years.
Yep, absolutely. That's exactly what I would say.
I mean, he can argue though that while Bin Laden was alive, they were united and they were resisting division and fragmentation. But we saw evidence of the
you said this earlier.
The strife between
right.
Al-Qaeda in Iraq and these and
like AQI was historically their most problematic branch.
Yep. I just wish I can, get that alternate reality up and see how Bin Laden would have handled that, if he could have handled that. I'm of the mind that split was inevitable at some point, given the way that the success that the Islamic State had in, it was still Al-Qaeda, was having in Syria at that time. They were I think they were smelling themselves at that point and then decided, it was worth confronting the global leadership. I mean, look, it was happening under Zawahiri's leadership. I'm sorry, under Bin Laden's leadership at that time. So, the kernels of it anyway. All right, we'll move on to the next one here. Again, I'm going to quote Zawahiri. He says, quote, Osama bin Laden pointed out the practical way to liberate Palestine and every occupied Muslim land, and that is by striking the head to force them to withdraw and negotiate. What's your take on this? A little bit of truth there, a little bit of untruths in there. What do you think, Caleb?
I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, obviously, it's true in Afghanistan, of where America was forced to withdraw. They were forced to negotiate with the Taliban. Obviously, Palestine is a whole other issue in and of itself that I don't necessarily want to get into, but I don't think that's true in Palestine.
I think, and I'm going to real quick on that. I think this is a failure of Al-Qaeda is to really, there was a time there in the late 2000s, early 2010s where you had some small groups that were looked to be a nucleus of a Al-Qaeda, branch forming in the Palestinian territories. But it went up against Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the Palestinian Authority, which were entrenched and organized, and we're not going to have any of that. So I think that I always thought Al-Qaeda's messaging on the Palestinian issue, Israel Palestinian issue, has been one of hopefulness, but not one of practicality. I think the cards are stacked against them in that one.
No, I mean, I certainly don't know as much as our colleague Joe Tersman, but there is a small group in Gaza still called Jaish al-Umma, which proclaims, to be like at least AQ affiliated. I don't think it's ever came out and directly stated like Ansaru in Nigeria that, that we are Al-Qaeda, but, they share all AQ's propaganda. They send congratulations to AQ. They send condolences when AQ leaders die. It's very clear indication that they are at least within the network. But they're small. They're a small group. Other AQ groups or AQ, aligned groups in Gaza have been, like you said, taken out by Hamas, or, switch sides to IS and either ate itself alive by members going to Syria or again being taken out by Hamas. So AQ has definitely pretty much failed in their attempts to set up anything in Palestine. Obviously that could change in the future, but it doesn't seem likely with the stranglehold that Hamas has over Gaza, especially, and then the West Bank. I think that's more necessarily related to Palestine issues in general, not global jihad. Could be wrong. Again, this is a question more for Joe. Which, by the way, shout out to Joe. Everyone follow him.
Yeah, Joe Tersman. Why follow him, guys?
But I think the bigger point here with this quote is to negotiate. This is absolutely the key word in this whole long sentence of, some have stated, some analysts stated that, negotiations hurt AQ's brand, but how? They want negotiations. They do negotiations all the time. They negotiated with Mauritania in the early 2010s or late 2000s to have some sort of ceasefire in return for Mauritania not attacking them. They reportedly did the same in Burkina Faso under the old regime of Blaise Compaoré, who was ousted in 2014. You have current deals in central Mali. You have AQ supporting the Taliban's process in Afghanistan. There was a recent thing just today of the Al-Qaeda linked, Haqqani network, which its leader, Sirajuddin Haqqani, is also a dual-hatted AQ leader of brokering talks between Pakistan and the Afghan Taliban. This is something that AQ does all the time. It might detract, more hardline members into IS or to elsewhere who, don't want to do negotiations. But by and large, if AQ can negotiate in a way that will put them on top or leave them in a better position or get them essentially what they want, which has kind of been the case in central Mali, they'll do it. They don't have a problem with it. They're let me be clear, they're not negotiating in good faith. They're definitely not negotiating to have any sort of, quote unquote peace. They're not negotiating, in a sense that, you and I might think of negotiations of, both sides make concessions to have some sort of, mutually agreeable, agreement. That's not the case here. AQ is going to negotiate for something that's going to put them on top. But negotiations in general, they don't see as a bad thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Afghanistan was case in point. We know that Al-Qaeda supported those negotiations, and they were very supportive of the Taliban's negotiations because they believed it would lead to the U.S. withdrawal. Caleb, you had mentioned negotiates the key word. There's a second key word, and that's in Zawahiri's statement and key phrase, the practical way, right? Al-Qaeda's practical. They will negotiate if necessary. Again, this is one of the biggest difference between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Islamic State's never going to negotiate or approve of negotiations or have one of its, a group that it works with negotiate. And Al-Qaeda recognizes it. And like you would perfectly know, Al-Qaeda supported the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan's negotiations back in 2007 that put the TTP in control of significant portions of northern Pakistan. We know that because we saw that in the bin Laden files. They've negotiated with the Iranians to facilitate a release of an Iranian diplomat who was being held in Pakistan, in exchange for some better concessions for its leaders who were sheltering in Iran, and some were, I don't want to get into that whole thing, but loose detention. But Al-Qaeda wanted to really greater freedom of movement for its leadership that was based inside of Iran. So the practicality there is that's what allows them to negotiate.
Right. I mean, this could be something in the future that does come back to bite them in the ass of supporters who don't want to negotiate, of defecting to the Islamic State.
In Syria was this, They were too clever by half. They were trying to work with the various groups, like internal negotiations between jihadist movements and the Free Syrian Army. And do we let Turkey work with us? That's what led to a lot of the problems, was the practicalities. I think it's already has hurt them. So it's a mixed bag. It gets you Afghanistan, but it caused you problems in Iraq and Syria. Right. Really caused them to lose their Iraq. There's
one caveat, I guess, with this potential blowback between their supporters, is that, like, we know they've historically done this for over a decade, longer, if not.
Yeah, definitely longer. I would say
if we were going to see, these large scale defections because of negotiations, not necessarily because of IS in general, of what happened with that split or what happened in Syria, but specifically because of negotiations, I would suspect we would have already seen these large scale defections that would have, really hampered their capabilities in these specific regions. Like in Mali, like we didn't really see too many large-scale defections specifically because of negotiations. Now, there were defections to IS in Mali for other reasons, but negotiations doesn't seem to be this large-scale movement to defect away from AQ. But that could change. Always could change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, and as they have success with negotiations, Afghanistan, this is what made the Afghanistan so dangerous, right? The Taliban showed that you can use the process. What happened in like Mauritania and Mali, a lot of that's under the covers, right? And I think the jihadists are aware of what's happening. But Afghanistan, that's an entire country that went under jihadist control. It was visible. It was out in the open for everyone to see for years. And, the Taliban have an emirate and the Islamic State does not. It doesn't have its physical caliphate, and it controls, I can't think of any, some places in Africa, obviously, but it's not controlling a state like the Taliban does. And of course, Al-Qaeda isn't controlling Afghanistan, but we know Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are inextricably linked, and Al-Qaeda supported that Taliban takeover.
As obviously things could change, but as of May 2022, I don't see negotiations as hurting the AQ brand.
I think any of that hurt Al-Qaeda's brand, it's already happened, right? I think
if it was going to, it's already done. Yeah.
It's right. The bulk of that that was really the Iraq, Syria, 2013, 14, 15 time frame when people were choosing sides. I think they've now chose sides. And
I'm sure it happened in Afghanistan with like ISK. There was probably some dudes who probably didn't support AQ's support of the process, but it's already happened.
Right. Exactly. And, what it may turn off is current and future recruits, but that's not breaking off of leadership, like the Islamic movement, Uzbekistan breaking off from the Taliban. But then again, that wasn't related to negotiations. That was primarily largely over the Taliban hiding, the death of its emir. So
right.
of Mullah Omar. I mean, those things hurt Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and these groups far more than anything.
The thing with that is like, if you're going to lose recruits over negotiations, you're going to be able to gain other recruits for a myriad of other reasons.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, to me, look, we recognize, this is what we do. If it works to our advantage, we're going to do it. I mean, look, if, again, you and I aren't wired like you're red meat, bloodthirsty jihadist. But if I was to be a jihadist, I'd want to be with the thinking man's jihadist. I think they got a better chance. It might not appeal to the red meat jihadists. But then again,
no, I mean,
if you have
obviously it doesn't appeal to everyone. Obviously, there are jihadists out there who want that really, really hyper violent brand, and you just see that, especially in Africa with new branches. But
yeah, and with the Islamic State losing its physical caliphate because of its actions, how much did that affect their recruiting? I think that at the end of the day, this all probably comes out in a wash, or it might tilt to one side.
Ebb and flow as well. I think it's an ebb and flow of you're going to lose people because of negotiations or whatever, but it's probably by and large already happened. But you'll gain new recruits for other reasons, and that could, that whole dynamic could change within the next 5 years.
Exactly. Okay, moving on to the next video. This was an interesting one by Al-Qaeda. It isn't Zawahiri, a speech by Zawahiri alone. It's a production where Zawahiri is quoted within there. But basically, what Al-Qaeda is saying here is that there are a lot of similarities between the jihad in Kashmir and the situation in, the Israel-Palestinian situation. They go down a history of, the formation of the state of Israel and how, Kashmir was treated by the United Nations. But there's a couple of interesting things in here that we want to highlight. Al-Qaeda seems to be, or we predicted this, by the way. We knew that once the Taliban won in Afghanistan, that the Al-Qaeda would reprioritize the jihad in Kashmir, because what you had happening was a lot of Kashmiri and jihadists or Pakistani jihadist groups that were hot on waging jihad in Kashmir. Were focusing a lot of their efforts inside of Afghanistan. They regrouped in Afghanistan to help the Taliban achieve its victory. We know groups like Harkat al-Mujahideen and Lashkar-e-Taiba and the alphabet soup of Pakistani jihadist groups that fight in Kashmir, but are still supportive or allies with Al-Qaeda, with the Taliban. They recognized it was important to get a win there. And now, obviously they're going to want payback for that. They're going to want their cause to be supported. And it is a cause supported by Al-Qaeda. It's also a cause, it's also a cause supported by the Taliban. And in this video, they're not calling just for jihad in Kashmir, but in the whole of India. So I'll read you. This is a quote from Zawahiri. Here we go. "Oh, our people in Kashmir, your battle is the battle of the entire Muslim Ummah. Your theater is not just Kashmir, but the entire Indian subcontinent. So prepare yourselves for bleeding your enemies to death in the entire subcontinent." So Al-Qaeda is saying not just Kashmir, but throughout all of India, you should reinitiate attacks. And if you recall, in the 2000s and early to mid 2010s, there was significant terrorist attacks by a group called the Indian Mujahideen, which really was just a branding of Pakistani jihadist groups that gave them some plausible deniability. It really was mostly Lashkar-e-Taiba, but other groups allied with it. Al-Qaeda had a role in it as well. They were launching suicide attacks on trains and other infrastructure, very deadly suicide attacks throughout India. The Indian security forces, intelligence really have tamped down on this. They have a very interesting method of dealing with this problem. I'll discuss that another day. And it's not kinetic. That's what's interesting about it. But, the narrative that I'm going to also read you, what the narrator of the video here had said, this gets back to us predicting what this happened. It says, "The best example for you to continue your journey on the path of jihad and martyrdom until cow worshippers are defeated. Just as your brothers in Afghanistan defeated the cowboys in an epic war that lasted 2 decades. So again, they're saying, both Zawahiri and the narrator are saying, we had success in Afghanistan. Now it's time to bring the jihad into India. Caleb, what are your any initial thoughts on this?
I think the main one, looking at his quote about, your battle is the battle of the entire Muslim Ummah, that's Zawahiri putting Al-Qaeda's fight within, the religious framework of Islam. There's a famous, hadith or saying of the Prophet Muhammad that talks about this epic giant battle between the Muslims and non-Muslims in the Indian subcontinent, and that the Muslims will be victorious. That's what Zawahiri is referring to. Literally, that's what he's referring to, and he's putting AQ's whole, ideology or whole, strategy in the Indian subcontinent within that religious framework. And this gets back to what we were talking about earlier of like, these videos aren't made for us. This is a case in point. This video is not for us. This video is for Muslims. This video is for people who want to see that fight in a religiously legitimate way. And Zawahiri is providing that.
Yeah, it really is. That's what we have to remember. A lot of these videos, I know we've said it numerous times, but know who the audience is. It's very obvious when these videos are pointed at us. And it's not as obvious. Well, I mean, I think it's obvious to you and I and those of us who, look at this on a regular basis and have an open mind, but it's not so obvious. Like, again, this message, in that video, he's calling on the narrator is calling on Indian Muslims to join that jihad, to rise up against the Indians. So they're trying to recruit India has I believe the first or second, I think it's the second largest Muslim population on the planet. It's somewhere around 190 or 200 million. I think Indonesia is the first, if I recall. Correct me if I'm wrong. Send me an email if so. But this is definitely, it's a powerful message that they're sending to potential recruits or those disaffected with, into the situation in Kashmir.
They're literally telling these Muslims that if you want to, follow the hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, you have to join us.
This is the other part of, I think this is, they're making religious justifications for their actions. The common view of Al-Qaeda, is that, they're just bloodthirsty. They want to conduct terror attacks. No, they want to restore the caliphate and impose their version of Sharia. So they're making religious justifications in order to wage jihad. It's that simple. And it's effective to those who are susceptible to that type of message.
And it's also not subtle messaging. This isn't the second point I want to make with this is that prophetic battle from the Prophet Muhammad is called in Arabic Ghazwat al-Hind, or like the battle of al-Hind, al-Hind being the Arabic word for the Indian subcontinent. Well, AQ created a group in 2017 called Ansar Ghazwat al-Hind, where the helpers or partisans of that battle. It's literally AQ's branch in Kashmir. It's set up again in 2017. I believe it was a splinter of Hizbul Mujahideen, which is another jihadist group operating in Kashmir.
Is a friend of Al-Qaeda. This is lives openly in Islamabad, supported by the Pakistani establishment or deep state, whatever you want to call them. Yeah, Hizbul Mujahideen may as well be Al-Qaeda.
So you had like an official Al-Qaeda splinter from Hizbul Mujahideen that made it official that we are AQ in Kashmir. Again, Ansar Ghazwat al-Hind, which I believe is still active. I believe they claimed an attack earlier this year in India that Indian authorities, I think, if I remember correctly, claimed that it wasn't legit, but who knows if it actually was. Regardless, AQ has this group that its name itself harkens back to the Hadith, which gets back to this wider, religious legitimacy argument that we're making here. Of like they see this as part of that prophecy or that saying of Muhammad, which is supposed to, to incite the local Muslims into being like, this is something we should support. Hence the Ansar part of the name, or the helpers or partisans of that battle.
Yeah. It's Indian officials that I spoke to, think they have a good handle on this. And my argument to them was, because of Afghanistan looks pretty good right now, or Afghanistan is basically the sponge that was absorbing a lot of the energy of these groups. But my argument back to them was wait till Afghanistan's over. Wait till these groups consolidate. And then I think you're going to see a bleed back into the fight. I mean, Kashmir is the natural, the flashpoint for this. But, as we saw with the Indian Mujahideen, again, back in the 2000s, early 2010s, they were able to carry out some very high profile, very successful attacks that really rattled the Indian state.
Right. So and here you have AQ trying to incite something similar.
Yep. They're trying to get it back. So the Ansar Ghazwat al-Hind, had a string of leaders who were killed. Tell us a little bit about that, Caleb. I know you followed that. Just tell us about how its leaders, some of the challenges it faced.
It was founded by this guy named Zakir Musa, which Zakir Musa was, a prominent commander in Hizbul Mujahideen who, wanted to be more closely aligned with Zawahiri. He wanted to be more closely aligned with the AQ, network. So he founded his own group. Made it very clear that he was, loyal to Zawahiri. AQ propaganda, global propaganda, advertised the group, with every statement, every video it put out. So he was the leader from 2017 to 2019. He was killed in an Indian military operation. Since then, AGH, or Ansar Ghazwat al-Hind, has gone through a series of leaders. I don't think any of them are quite as prominent as what Zakir Musa was. But the point is, even despite all these leadership losses, they're still around. They are still saying that they are active in Kashmir. So if, AQ is successful in, re-inciting Muslims for this cause, it's going to go through that group.
Yeah, exactly. And
the question is, where does AGH fit in the wider AQIS hierarchy? Which, this is my question for you. You follow that more closely than I do. Obviously they would be part of AQIS, right?
Yeah, my understanding is they are part of Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, as is configured, but I've never seen a statement of...
They have separate media than AQIS too, so I don't know.
Yeah, it's kind. I wonder if it's like JNIM and AQIM and
sub branch of
just
AQIS.
that's sort of given the latitude to do its own thing. And there's another part here too, right? Is the Pakistani jihadist groups, the Lashkar-e-Taibas and Hizbul Mujahideen, Harkat al-Mujahideen, and all these other groups that like to fight. Now, what Al-Qaeda typically does is it takes members of these groups and allows and brings them in. So how much latitude these groups like to fight on their own, and there's reasons for that. They get the open support of the Pakistani state, or sometimes the quiet support of the Pakistani state. Whereas Al-Qaeda, that's sort of a bridge too far, but the Pakistani state knows what's happening with groups like Ansar al-Hind. They don't like the conflict between the Pakistani state and Ghazwat Ansar al-Hind not because they want to wage jihad in Kashmir. It's because they don't answer to the Pakistani state like Lashkar-e-Taiba and other groups do. And, look, we discussed that, a little bit that, once the consolidation happened, that Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent and the Pakistani groups are going to need new theaters. Caleb, talk a little bit about what are the challenges to this, particularly from the Islamic State Khorasan province.
Right. It's not just the Pakistani groups. It's also like the Central Asian jihadists that operate in Afghanistan are going to need some sort of, release valve of a lot of their pent up, aggression or desire to strike their home countries. And we're seeing this a little bit now with the Islamic State Khorasan claiming, attacks on Uzbek or Tajik positions, firing rockets from Afghanistan into those respective borders. This is going to be, I think, the long-standing challenge for AQ and AFPAC of handling these foreign jihadist groups within their sphere. Let's be honest, a lot of these Central Asian jihadist groups in Afghanistan are, completely under the Al-Qaeda network. They are Al-Qaeda's ethnic battalions, to a large degree. Some of them are probably less so, but regardless, AQ is going to have to play a balancing game of not wanting to piss off the Taliban, but also allowing the Central Asians to release enough steam that doesn't result in defections to the Islamic State, who allow those aforementioned, rocket attacks into Uzbek or Tajikistan. So that's going to be the biggest challenge, I think, going forward, is how does AQ play that game of how do they allow, all these Central Asians or Pakistanis to do what they need to do, but not face the wrath of the Taliban of cracking down on that.
Yeah. And, they also have an interest in the Taliban maintaining their safe havens for them, because let's face it, these groups they've been fighting for decades. They now get a little time to refit, to regroup, to breathe a little bit, to maybe get some, train those new recruits and think about their next steps. But once they start thinking about those next steps, there's going to need to be these guys join the fight. They join these groups to wage jihad. That's that's their religious duty. That's what they're told they're there to do. And that's why they join. You use the term, Caleb, a relief valve. And this is a common term that's also used by, with regards to Pakistan and its, the groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Pakistani jihadist groups, and also applies to the Afghan Taliban and Pakistani Taliban as well, which of course, again, this is all sort of that AQ orbit or the AQ allied groups. And Pakistan is known when, when its jihadists, local jihadists get a little bit uppity, because remember, I mentioned this earlier, members of these groups, one day guys will be a Lashkar-e-Taiba, the next day they're joining Al-Qaeda, and then the next day they're fighting for the Taliban, and then they're back in Lashkar-e-Taiba, but they want to fight. And if Pakistan holds the reins too closely on Kashmir, and Afghanistan isn't a place where these guys could fight, sometimes that bleeds over into attacks into Pakistan. So Pakistan also likes to open up this relief valve to allow jihadists to go into Kashmir, and train. And there's been, reports of numerous training camps right along the border in Pakistan, occupied Kashmir, used by all of these groups. I remember one point in time, Indian intelligence said they had charted 70 camps. This was, had to be half a decade ago or so. But those camps haven't gone anywhere. Pakistan will open this relief valve at some point, because it doesn't like to have rest of jihadists within its borders. And if that allows Al-Qaeda to go in there too, well, again, while they may not like Al-Qaeda because of its independence, better that they fight in Kashmir than they fight in Pakistan.
And AQ is going to have to play this game itself in Afghanistan. I think if I were ISK, Islamic State Khorasan, this is prime recruitment territory. You're going to be able to take away people who want to do attacks against, Uzbek, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, elsewhere, by saying, hey, AQ is not going to allow you to do this. They need to abide by their Taliban masters. Join us. And we've seen that happen to a degree already.
I think one of the groups that has the biggest problems with this is the Turkestan Islamic Party, or the East Turkestan Islamic Movement. Because
same group, by the way. There's people out there who like to say they're different.
Oh no, they're the same. Yeah, I'm putting exactly both out there just because they're known as two things, and people treat them as two things, and it's one and the same. They're cozying up to the Taliban's cozying up to China. Has to be a big concern to TIP leadership. They're going to have to figure out ways. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda and the Turkestan Islamic Party leadership has to figure out a ways to keep those guys in the fight, but not piss off the Taliban by reinitiating jihad in China, which is what they ultimately want to do.
Right. And we've perhaps already seen this, faltering. There's an analyst I want to shout out. His name's Lucas Weber. He does a good job of looking at, the TIP and, not only TIP, but ISK's, ethnic recruits, Central Asian ethnic recruits. He's already documented, several Uyghurs who have, likely left TIP because of these issues. If they felt that they weren't going to be able to do what they wanted to do, IS allowed them that opportunity. Going forward, I think this is going to be a big issue for AQ to rein in all these Central Asian groups, and TIP is probably the most evident one that's going to be a struggle. Again, I just want to be clear that talking rank and file, I don't think that the TIP's overall Amir, Abdul Haq al-Turkestani, who, by the way, sits on Al-Qaeda's main Shura Council. I don't think he'll defect, obviously, but it's the rank and file that are going to be an issue for AQ and TIP.
Yeah, it's a hard message for them. And I think what the leadership has to attempt to do is preach patience. Look how patient we were in Afghanistan. It worked. It takes time. It takes, we need to secure our base in Afghanistan will help us achieve victory in Xinjiang, right? I mean, things of that nature. But those are hard messages to internalize for the bloodthirsty jihad now crowd. So yeah, I think that's, I think that we've nicely kind of come full circle in explaining those challenges that exist for Al-Qaeda. And then again, the Islamic State, again, on its side has to go, well, we've had this method, but what do we have to show for it today? The Taliban, and Al-Qaeda, they have to show Afghanistan and Central Asia, we're hunted. You know, and another advantage and that gets back to the practicality, right? In that statement from Zawahiri, you know, is being willing to work with states, right? The Taliban took state aid from the Pakistanis. They took state aid from the Iranians to wage jihad against the Americans. And Al-Qaeda knew this was happening and allowed it. And, you know, again, that could be, you know, but that also can work against them. The messaging from the Islamic State can be, see, look, they're tools of these foreign state, you know,
which it is. It very much is the argument of IS against AQ.
Yep. So, you know, the interesting thing to watch in all this is to see, you know, how this messaging works, how it impacts the groups. But like, it's hard to argue against the Al-Qaeda brand of success when you look at Afghanistan and Somalia and Mali and other places. I
think that's the too long didn't read or too long didn't listen version of this podcast, is that AQ is definitely way more successful than what some are probably believing or stating. But yet they do have severe challenges that they are facing right now and probably will face in the future. Doesn't mean that they are faltering to any huge degree, as what some analysts might, you know, lead you to believe. But it's not to say that they aren't perfect, or they are perfect.
Yeah, that's split between. Again, I go back to that being the singular greatest defeat, or for Al-Qaeda was the split between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State.
Right. And to be clear, there are areas around the world where AQ absolutely did fail that we didn't mention.
Right.
A lot of Africa, especially Central and, you know, Mozambique, they failed. They absolutely failed in those regards, and the Islamic State took them up on it. You know, this is an area where AQ could falter in the future. But as of right now, as of again May 2022, I think AQ is in a much better position than what some believe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we could look at Southeast Asia. I mean, I don't think Al-Qaeda.
But Nigeria being another failure.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
Philippines and Indonesia. Okay, you know, look, they still have, you know, Jamaat al-Islamiyah still exists to a degree, and there's some offshoots in the Islamic States in Philippines, but
they lost Abu Sayyaf.
Yeah, right. Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, but like, you know, so again, it's an ebb and flow, right? Can they recruit? Can they regroup? Can they, you know?
No, and of course, like AQ's messaging isn't always, you know, successful either. You know, we talk about Kashmir, but they tried to incite Muslims in the Central African Republic in 2014, 2015, at the height of, you know, CAR's violent civil war, and it was insanely violent, still is, but AQ tried to capitalize on it. AQ, even Zawahiri, made statements about the Muslims in CAR should rise up. They should join Islamic groups. They should start jihad in Central Africa. And it didn't work. You know? So there are times where AQ's messaging works. There are times where it doesn't.
Yeah, times where the Islamic State's messaging works. And I think that's a perfect example of it, right? They've gotten a grip on the Central African Republic. They got gripped on, I think, in Mozambique, and then
not CAR. They do IS.
I'm sorry,
definitely has DRC,
Democratic Republic of Congo. My bad. Getting my African.
Too many acronyms.
Yeah. You know, I guess that just exposed my geographic challenges.
This is my bad. I have like such. I don't know if it's photographic memory, but like geographically, like I could look at a map and then just immediately remember it. So
it's why I hate you and Tom. You guys with your photographic memories, and me with my workman effort that has to constantly relook up things. It's quite maddening. So I love both love and hate.
I do second guess myself all the time though, of like, am I remembering that correctly? And then I have to like go to Google Maps, and sure enough, I am.
It's a little secret. I created the Long War Journal literally as my notebook. I mean, and I put little bookmarks in my brain, and I'm like, I know I wrote about that 8 years ago, and I can go and find it. It's literally my journal, and obviously yours and Tom's and everyone else's, that contributes. But that was the original purpose of me starting to write. When I originally started doing this, was literally putting my thoughts on paper and being able to access them, and kind of developed.
Well, I'm glad you did.
So no, and
not for my own selfish reasons, as you know, working for you for 8 years, but also just the service you're providing for the community and field.
Well, thank you, Caleb. Caleb, you had mentioned to me the other day. It's been 8 years now?
Yes, 8 years. So that means in 2 more years, I've been working for you for 10 years.
Working with me, Caleb.
Sorry.
I
call you my boss, but I guess you're not technically.
No, Caleb, it's been a pleasure. And I hope there's another 8 years and another 8 years after that working with you.
Inshallah.
Just to watch you grow over time and absorb and understand this. And again, I know your focus is on Africa, but whenever, when I read these statements, I got to get Caleb on. Caleb knows this. Your ability to, follow what's happening in other theaters. Sometimes Caleb will send me an email about something and it's like, hey, Bill, did you see this? What's happening in Pakistan? And I'm like, damn it, I should have known that before him. And, but that's how on top of the ball.
Just to caveat to all the listeners, I am terminally online. So I need new hobbies.
Listen, my advice to you is at some point I was going to die because I was terminally online and I had to take a step back. I mean, literally my health was going into the toilet because I just was working, anywhere from 12 to 16-hour days. And, start losing, when you're married, Caleb, you lose a little touch with your family. I saw that coming and was like, I got to step back a little. But that's why I can rely on you now because I was trying to track everything in Africa and trying to track here. And that's why it's one of the reasons why it's a pleasure to have you.
We definitely don't track everything around the world as closely as I do in Africa. I try to read the news and keep up with it. Especially, Twitter is such a good resource for that. But I like to say that I'm conversant in other areas, I guess. I could probably play a game of Jeopardy, but that's about it. I wouldn't call myself quite as a specialist as I am in Africa.
Yeah, I'll take
jihadism specialist, I guess, but specifically to Africa. But I do have a decent grasp, I guess, of elsewhere.
I'll take your grasp of what's happening in Afghanistan and Pakistan, or pick your theater over just about anyone out there. So,
thanks. That's high praise.
No, listen, it's well earned. So, all right, Caleb, I think this is a great place to wrap it up. Thank you again for joining me today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Listen, I'd have you on every episode if you could. But I know you got work to do. Thanks everyone for joining us for today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you can find us on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review, preferably a positive one. Thanks again, and we'll see you all again soon.